In the past 15 years, we've witnessed a migration of power and influence from Washington to Silicon Valley. As the U.S. government ground to a halt, tech titans raced into the void, moving at a speed that has left lawmakers wondering what happened as the world they governed left them behind. The power to create autonomous weapons, explore space, and surveil global society now rests with a handful of giant corporations. They wield unprecedented power and answer to almost no one but themselves. I'm Dawn Nakagawa, president of the Berggruen Institute, and this is Futurology. From the outset, science fiction has provided a product roadmap for Silicon Valley. Tech engineers chased utopias, and sometimes for reasons that are harder to explain, dystopias too. Centralization versus decentralization, open versus closed, EACs against DACs, doomers against foomers. If you live anywhere other than a narrow spit of land in Northern California, you might never have encountered these ideologies. But such niche debates now determine the fate of billions of people around the world. Their roots trace back to a post-war alliance between U.S. defense agencies and West Coast engineers, an effort to build systems that could manage society through feedback and control. In 1948, Norbert Wiener laid out a vision of intelligence grounded in cybernetics. He believed machines could mimic the feedback loops that underlie human behavior, that they could help us describe the complex systems all living beings inhabit, that they could contain and even direct the range of possible futures. In his seminal work, Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, he asserted that all intelligent behavior flowed from such feedback mechanisms. This thread of thought is woven tightly into the Valley's algorithms, which dictate the direction of our culture and increasingly hold sway in the halls of our nation's capital. In this episode, we're speaking with John Markoff. In the 80s, he became the first dedicated tech correspondent for the New York Times. In recent years, he's turned his attention to documenting the strains of thought that have made Silicon Valley what it is today. His book, What the Dormouse Said, How the 60s Counterculture Shaped the Personal Computing Industry, describes the origins of a question that is more urgent than ever. Will Silicon Valley create artificial intelligence that supplants humans, or a form of intelligence augmentation that will allow us to realize our true potential? As AI emerges among us, this debate among early technologists has taken on religious undertones. Markoff sat down in the heart of Silicon Valley with Futurology producer Grant Slater in February 2025, before Musk and Trump went through their very public divorce, to reflect on how we got here and how the cultural DNA of the Valley will continue to shape the global order. And now, John Markoff and Grant Slater on Futurology.
Hello, John.
Morning. Nice to be here.
We're here in the heart of Silicon Valley, which is kind of a little bit of the subject of what we're going to be talking about today. And I think it would be good to sort of look through the history of Silicon Valley and see if we can find breadcrumbs or clues to where things might be going in the future. And you are the right person to talk to about this because you spent a whole career looking at the history of Silicon Valley. You're a historian, basically, to some extent, I would say. Today, at this moment. But before you
Play
were
one on TV.
Yeah, exactly. But before you were a tech journalist. That was kind of where you got your career start. Over many decades, you've kind of filled a specific ecological niche in the ecosystem of Silicon Valley. One of your many claims to fame is that you were a paperboy to the houses of Larry Page and Steve Jobs before they lived there. And maybe that sort of like speaks to your existence in Silicon Valley and your interest in journalism. Possibly. I'm curious about that.
Well, it says a lot about what happened in Palo Alto. I mean, I also, besides delivering papers to those two houses, long before they lived there, I grew up playing in the Hewlett hewlett which is about a mile from where we are. And, the Hewlett-Packard company was, Palo Alto, when I was growing up, was kind of a company town. Hewlett-Packard was the defining company before Silicon Valley existed. So, in terms of sort of the thread of the emergence of this thing called technology journalism and how I got there, I had grown up here, and I left in 1967 to go to college and graduate school in the Northwest. And I grew up worshiping I.F. Stone. I grew up reading The Nation. I sort of gave up on academics in 1977 and decided, okay, I'd like to be a newspaper reporter. Lincoln Steffens. I read a lot about the investigative reporters during the Progressive era, and I decided to come back to Santa Clara County. And at that point, we were still in the wake of the end of the Vietnam War, and I was interested in the relationship, since where you want to go is to the relationship between Silicon Valley and the government. I was really interested in the role that what had become Silicon Valley while I was gone, the decade I was gone, would have with the U.S. military designing weapons, and that was what brought me back here, was to write about what was called the military industrial complex, the technology component of that, and I became part of a wave of people who wrote about the emerging personal computer industry. So I showed up in 1977, and I spent a half a decade freelancing, and wrote for all kinds of publications, but there was a particular news syndicate, alternative news syndicate called Pacific News Service, and it was wonderful because not only did they let me write about whatever I wanted to, but they circulated to at that point 350 newspapers around the country, including all of the major newspapers, Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, Washington Post. So I made no money, but I had bylines from everywhere around the country. And then, this industry emerged, the personal computer industry, from this hobbyist subculture, which was very different than the way most industries in America have come, what comes out of a hobbyist culture. So a journalistic community emerged to report on it. And the first weekly was called InfoWorld. And InfoWorld, of course, started in Palo Alto. I walked into InfoWorld in 1981. It's one of those serendipitous things. I had basically given up on freelancing because to be a really successful freelancer, you have to be really good at marketing yourself. And
nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. Truthfully,
not so good at it. And so I started looking at the Palo Alto Times for work because I'd been living on $3,500 a month and getting bylines all over the country, but not making no money. I thought, well, maybe I should get a job. And the first thing I saw in the Palo Alto Times was the city had just started a recycling program, and they were looking for people to drive the trucks. And I thought, well, that's honest work. I'll do that. So I called the guy up, and he said, I just hired, but stay in touch with me. I like college-educated guys. So I didn't get that job. And the next week, InfoWorld had an opening for a reporter, and I walked in with all my clips, and the woman who was the editor, who had been a secretary, had no journalistic experience, thought because I had all these clips that I was like, it was really the only job I've gotten by walking in off the street and answering a want ad, just cold calling and all of that. So I got hired as part of this group that were, to your point about tech journalism, there was this emerging community that were covering this new industry, information technology. And I was part of that. Yeah.
So there was kind of a hard fork in your life, like possibilities, like either to be a trash man or a journalist.
Serendipity. What had happened if I'd gotten who knows? I've always appreciated it.
We'll call it trash. We won't call it trash. So, I think I want to sort of talk about this from a little bit of a conceptual angle. So you're talking about the kind of the emergence of this community, and this community has obviously developed over time. I've spent a little bit of time in Silicon Valley around tech reporters and sort of observed that there's kind of two types of tech reporters to some extent. There's the type that kind of like breathlessly covers the latest product release or does reviews. There are publications dedicated to that. And then there's kind of another type of reporter, often, probably back in the day associated with newspaper reporters, but today less so, that is sort of like taking a step back or fulfilling a different role.
As this information technology sort of was influential in more and more parts of daily life, touched more people's life, the nature of the coverage changed. And there was a point where, so when I first arrived at the New York Times, there was tremendous value in what I think of as explanatory reporting. what I prided myself of being able to do was translate this technology so that it was understandable to people who might not have a technical background. That was the coin of the realm. Over time, the New York Times and I would argue much of the sort of general press lost interest in explanatory journalism, and there was a shift to what I think of as celebrity journalism, covering personalities and covering business. And so there was a shift away from trying to explain the technology and simply trying to track this. And it went along with, my framing of it comes directly out of what's called Moore's Law, the exponential change in this technology. And one of the ways I've charted that is each generation, each sort of turn of the coin in terms of semiconductor processing power has meant, for me, the most important aspect of that is not the increasing computer power, which is what most people focus on. It's actually the falling cost of computing. And not only did computers get faster, which is an exponential, they got cheaper faster. And so, mainframes were behind glass walls. Mini computers, were accessible to departments of corporations. Personal computers made it into first individual desks and then homes. And then with the smartphone, computing reached half the world's population. So what we've got now with generative AI and computers of mastered language is ubiquity. This is the the final frontier.
Ambience.
And so what I'm trying to say is that this became of interest to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Being an isolated. So there was this period when I became a text journalist where it was very novel. When I first got to the New York Times, we had to explain, if you were going to mention RAM, for example, you had to explain what RAM was, and how quaint. Nobody does that anymore.
But today we're experiencing the same thing with AI, transformers.
Well, yeah, that's true.
We have to do this kind of explanatory reporting to tell people like what's washing over them. I wonder, sort of as you flowed through this history, like in real time, how do you, and you've done very large projects, so you've written many books, we'll talk about some of them for sure. How do you decide, sort of editorial goals, what you'll dive into, what you'll latch on to, what are you looking for?
Well, so the career decision, I came here to write about the U.S. military and technology, and I did that for half a decade, for the first 5 years. And then I realized that the Vietnam War was over, the anti-war movement had gone, and I just hadn't gotten the memo, and I thought it was time to get a career. And I was very early on, 77 or 78, I ran across this book called The Micro-Millennium by Christopher Evans, who was a psychologist and a computer scientist, a Brit. And it was a book that made the argument that the microprocessor was going to change society. And I looked at it and I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting beat. And so, for the last half century, I've been sort of focusing on that. What's the impact this technology has had on society? And, it's pretty clear that it's transformed society completely. And so it was a good call.
And you grasp onto different ideologies, different moments that you sort of like frame these things around.
Yeah, I think, yes, that's been a general theme. Early on, I was very interested in finding sort of early signals and trying to sort of see what was just over the horizon. The other thing that I did that I think was probably a little bit different than a lot of reporters is I was fascinated, and it came out of being close to the community that was designing the early hobbyist computers. I went to early homebrew meetings. I associated with the people who were designing the computers. That's what I enjoyed, spending my time with those people rather than people who managed them. And when you're within that Silicon Valley subculture, you pick up things first. You follow their interests, and that's what I tried to do while I was working as a reporter.
Yeah, it's people reporting at the end of the day.
In a sense, yeah, their passions. And I was never super technical. I was more technical than most. I spent a year as a technology editor at Byte magazine. Byte was this, it was as big as Vogue at one point when magazines were big fat things. And there you wanted to translate new technologies for audiences that were technical themselves, and so that was challenging for me. That was my CS education, and it was a great opportunity.
Yeah. At the risk of getting too far ahead of ourselves,
okay.
I want to talk a little bit about, kind of the journalism is the fourth estate. If you look traditionally at journalism, especially organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they exist in this sort of realm of power. And, that has reflected itself over the years in something like the Washington Press Corps, who like kind of in another way kind of breathlessly covers the machinations of the president, sometimes on a minute level, sometimes on a big macro trend level. I think what we're seeing a little bit of today as this computing idea has become ambient is that the lines of the sort of like areas of power have kind of overlapped a little bit between Silicon Valley and politics to some extent. Do you see the tech reporter sort of press corps, or maybe we call it like the San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley press corps is having sort of a watchdog role over the years? Is there a public interest aspect of all this?
There's, boy, that is a very fraught and loaded area of discussion. First of all, there's this question of what is Silicon Valley, and the press's tendency in the last half year to year, well, maybe a little bit longer, to conflate the moguls, who've largely, and the ones I'm thinking of by and large, left Silicon Valley, with Silicon Valley. So there's the question of what is Silicon Valley. Then there's the question of whether the technology press was ever a watchdog. And that gets fraught too, because the tech press was always, I wouldn't say bought, but it was in danger of being bought. And there was a line that was very interesting. For example, in the 1980s, the British press, tech press, for example, would take the free plane flights to come to a trade show like Comtex that were offered by industry. Now, we couldn't do that because we had ethical guidelines. The Brits had another set of guidelines. And, our point was, well, if you're going to, that compromises your independence if you're going to, you're going to take a free plane flight. I mean, the traditional press was tightly circumscribed on what kinds of, largesse you could take from the people that you were covering. I think now those things are completely gone, is my sense. I mean, and even the notion of a mainstream media seems so quaint to me because it's not mainstream. Social media is mainstream media now. And what is social media? It is the fact that a large part of America now gets their news from a social media, although I think cable news is still a factor it gets very confused, and I'm still trying to sort it out. But the technology, there is watchdog reporting that has come out of the tech press, but I don't think of the tech press as a watchdog press in the sense that the Washington press sees its responsibility as a fourth estate and a balancing power. Whatever's left of it, I mean, that's another interesting too. We're not focusing on Washington, but if the New York Times now has 10% of the working journalists in America, where are we? I mean, what has happened and what's left? I mean, I think there is hope, but it's a very confused time. And if you look at the way the Valley voted in the most recent presidential election, it was overwhelmingly for Kamala Harris. Most particularly, the wealthiest communities in Silicon Valley voted by over 76% for Kamala Harris. So, what is Silicon Valley? I mean, if you look at boots on the ground, I think it's extremely progressive. One of the most progressive areas in the country, and that seems to have been lost in this. So
that narrative has kind of gone awry a little bit because we're looking at this sort of certain subsect of Silicon Valley that is like loud.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a topic of conversation later for us for sure. When you mention boots on the ground, I think that's important to think of in social media, for example, because we have this mainstream media that is social media. What you lack in that is boots on the ground in terms of journalists actually asking people questions. And I think, if the Washington Press Corps and in as much as you can call it the Silicon Valley Press Corps share something, it is sort of this tendency towards access journalism.
Yeah.
And sort of this need, it's not just buying flights, but also like if my whole like livelihood is based on my access to Steve Jobs or whatever, then it's hard for me to like write some stories.
Yeah. I mean, I had that problem as a New York Times reporter in covering Steve Jobs for years because of Jobs perception of the significance of the New York Times, I had access. And because of my own personal sort of respect for what Jobs had done, I was acutely aware of what became known as the reality distortion field. And when you get inside that field, and it was very difficult to maintain your independence, and I struggled with that for years because I respected him, but he was always trying to control the narrative, and that was a battle. But I think for the first decade of Jobs' tenure, second tenure as CEO at Apple, after every product announcement, it became very formulaic. He would give, I think it was the Journal, the Times, Newsweek, and Time, 15 minutes, and it was always a complete sort of hand-to-hand battle to get him to get Steve off message. That's what I tried to do. Sometimes I won, sometimes he won.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. It is truly kind of an ecosystem of the press and everything here in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And I think you've been a part of that. I think I want to pivot a little bit at this point because, there's like a rich history of this sort of idea of computation and the philosophy of computation, maybe as it relates to the philosophy of mind. I wonder, to the extent that you were covering this stuff in real time, you were engaging or thought you were engaging or had to engage with the philosophy of computing along the way.
I did, but only, I mean, day to day, it was a side question to me, but I took a half year off to write about the roots of the personal computer industry. This is this period 65 to 75. And I noticed something at the time that I think is directly at the heart of the question of the philosophy of computing, and that is that there were two laboratories in 1963. They opened in the same year, and that was really the dawn of interactive computing. We were moving from the era of the punch card to the era of interactive systems. One was started by John McCarthy, who had coined the term artificial intelligence. He believed it would take a decade at that point to create a thinking machine, thing that could do anything a human can do, either cognitively or physically. The same year, a man by the name of Douglas Engelbart started another laboratory on the other side of campus called the Augmentation Research Center, and Engelbart believed that computing should be used to extend human capabilities, to augment human intelligence. So you had this dichotomy between AI, which is a uniquely bad phrase, we can talk about that, and IA, intelligence augmentation. One wanted to replace the human and one wanted to extend the human. And of course, it's a paradox because if you extend the human, you need fewer humans. And I think that tension has been at the heart of modern computing since then. And now it's coming to it's come into sharp focus. Now we're really
actually got the AI.
Yeah. So we had IA, and Jobs, of course, said it best. He described the personal computer as a bicycle for the mind, which I think is an evocative and beautiful phrase. And I still think it's philosophically aligned with humanist values. And we can talk about AGI questions, but clearly computers have mastered human language. That is the interface. That's
crazy. It's bonkers, truthfully.
Yeah.
And I think I've read about this AI versus IA sort of framing that you've done, and I find it very fascinating, of human-centered versus machine-centered to some extent. I think it also, when I look through the ideological strains or sort of the way the characters that you animate are thinking about it, I also sort of think about some other Silicon Valley sort of like, I think kind of like back and forths about like hierarchy versus network, or centralized versus decentralized, open versus closed. And I think that also kind of underscores a lot. It all, right. But we're talking about I don't know. Do you think those are the same kind of communities, if those overlap with each other?
I think they overlap to various extents. We'd have to pick each one apart. The open versus closed thing is interesting because that's been an overriding tension in computing. Bill Gates was here yesterday at the Computer History Museum celebrating the first volume of his trilogy, and of course Gates, started this confrontation in what was it, 1975, by writing a letter to the hobbyists accusing them of stealing his software, and that was really the first sort of collision between the open world of shared software and this closed proprietary world, and that's been a tension ever since.
Yeah, I think so. This is kind of the topic of one of your great books, of the Dormouse book. Can you what is
what
it
the
called?
Dormouse said? How the 60s counterculture shaped the personal computer industry.
That was sort of your sort of first magnum opus.
I think of it as an exercise in anti-autobiography. I mean, at that point, I was trying to understand. I had grown up here, and I went away for a decade, and I came back, and there was this thing called Silicon Valley was here, and I was trying to understand why Silicon Valley happened, and I'm still trying to understand why Silicon Valley happened. And I think I have some other thoughts about that we can talk about. But at that point, I'm not a technological determinist. I mean, that's sort of one of the things we could talk about too. I really believe that technologies are shaped by culture, and in turn, culture shapes technology. I mean, that's sort of my view of the world.
Can you define technological determinism for us a little bit?
Yeah, well, there is this view that that technological the direction of technological change is inevitable, and that the mainframe is followed by that a very definitive set of things will come out of this industrial process that is called semiconductor manufacturing, and that you can predict things, and it will go off into the future in certain ways. And, there are different strains of technological determinism. I mean, Kevin Kelly has kind of a Christian strain in a certain way of, there's some sort of deity in the works. There is sort of this biological form of technological determinism. I can't cite chapter and verse, but there's still a sharp, in the academic world, there's a sharp debate over culture versus technologically determined outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, there's a Marxist version of this
that's
too.
Right. That's right. That's Marx.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea that like sort of our future is determined, and we have to adapt to like in the inexorable march of progress to some extent. So that was the Dormouse. And you wrote another book that I think also sort of continued this narrative about the march of progress in so much as it relates to the relationship between humans and machines. And that book is called Machines of Loving Grace. I'm wondering where that title comes from and why you chose it for this book.
Well, it comes from a Berggruen poem. And I chose it because it was evocative. And if you've read that poem, it's just the best. And Berggruen had spent a week, maybe just a week, as a writer in residence at Caltech. This is very early, sometime in the mid to early 60s, I think. Nobody knew about computing then, and Berggruen didn't know about computing. But somehow he came across a set of ideas about the impact of these machines, and really sort of took a poet's touch to explaining, how they might affect human relationships. And I just found it profound.
I'm wondering if you'd like to read the poem. I have
if you
it over here.
I would love to. the whole
down to read poem. So we're going to have a dramatic reading from John Markoff of
I've never done.
Of a Richard Berggruen poem.
Yeah, all watched over by machines of loving grace. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony, like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think, right now please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics, where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think, it has to be, of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace. So it's evocative in a number of ways. I mean, I think there are three big ideas to have come out of Silicon Valley. I'll set generative AI aside for a second. But in the 1960s and then in the 1980s, in the 1960s, there was Engelbart and Kay. Engelbart had this system called NLS, which really was the first model of computing. McCarthy, of course, had this model of artificially intelligent machines, and Alan Kay had this notion of the Dynabook, which is what we use now as modern personal computers. He basically, Engelbart, and we're talking about philosophy of computation again, saw computing as a machine that you drove through cyberspace. That was Engelbart's version. Kay, in contrast, I mean, he was a deep believer in Engelbart, but he understood that computing would be a universal medium. He was the first person to really understand the digitization of every separate domain by computing. And then in the 1980s, also at Xerox PARC, there was, and this gets back to the poem, Mark Weiser, who came up with this notion of ubiquitous computing, which I thought was, in a sense, the most profound. That is that you take everyday objects and you place computing into them, and they become magic. The smartphone. What is that? You take the telephone and you put computing into it, and that was sort of in terms of ideas to come out of Silicon Valley, the Valley likes to think of it as this tremendously innovative place. I think it's actually a great engineering community that's been thriving off of a couple of big ideas. And so if you talk about fundamental innovation, there hasn't been that much. And most of it happened at the front end of the Valley. And once again, we can talk about the roots of generative AI. Mm-hmm. But
and it's basically the same discussion all along. So to return to the Brodigan poem a little bit, I think, that in that week or whatever at Caltech as an artist in residence, you said he sort of grokked certain things. And those things I think are very much related to the idea of cybernetics, ecosystems, these are ideas that I think have kind of animated Silicon Valley from the beginning. And just a quick aside, I want to say that there's a little of a side on the Brodigan poem. It existed, it came out in a chapbook. Brodigan was kind of like a roving poet, bum to some extent. But he was a great writer and a writer of many books as well. He would go and pass out his poems on the streets of San Francisco. Specifically when he released this chapbook, it came with a copyright. And the copyright said, "Permission is granted to reprint any of these poems in magazines, books, and newspapers if they are given away free," which I think is kind of interesting because
Stallman-esque.
It's also kind of it's a early iteration of the open source movement. Yes. Copyleft, these sort
Absolutely.
of this debate between open and closed. It's interesting how that arose in culture as well.
That is fascinating. I did not remember that, and I'm going to go pursue that actually. Who knew that Brodigan was the source of open source?
I'm not sure if he is the source, but
yeah.
But
I mean,
I think all these
67, the copyleft idea was not really around at that point. It came later.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the fact that all these movements are iterative and their ideas building on ideas. And so actually I think, he was existing in this very much in this atmosphere that you've described, this counterculture 60s thing, but I think you kind of have to go back a little bit farther because obviously this idea of cybernetics that he was cottoning on to must have existed before that. So if we go back a little bit farther, I'm wondering if we can sort of do some work to define what cybernetics is for our audience.
I'm not authoritative, but Norbert Wiener was an engineer who coined the term cybernetics in the late 1940s, I believe. And it was the science of command and control. And what's remarkable about, I mean, there are many directions we can go with, and you'll want to, but the one that really struck me is in reading from John McCarthy's archive, I learned where the term artificial intelligence has come from. And McCarthy in 55, 56 was in the process of starting this Dartmouth summer workshop, which was going to focus on machines that might think. And he was a MIT faculty colleague of Norbert Wiener. And McCarthy hated Wiener. He found him bombastic and a boor, which was probably true. But he wanted nothing to do with him. And Wiener had created this, academic community of cybernetics, and he wanted to separate himself from that community and didn't want to deal with Norbert Wiener, and so he came up with an alternative phrase, which I think was a terrible unfortunate choice of words, but because it created this obsession with the anthropomorphization of these machines as a result of it. I mean, we've been doing that ever since, and that I think was a horrible wrong term. I think if we had kept Wiener's term, cybernetics, which I think applies to this field quite well, it would have been better all. And Wiener actually had, there was a European conference in the early 1950s about cybernetic machines that might think. I mean, it was not that this was created in America. It had European roots as well, which is an interesting bit of history.
Yeah. I mean, I think so where does the word cybernetics come from? It actually comes from the Greek, I have it here.
Okay.
Kybernetikos, which means good at steering. So
Yes.
good at steering society, good at steering things forward, like having control. So the title of Wiener's book is Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. So you already start to see this like conflation of animals and machines, even at that point. And I think the thing that I note when going back through all of this history that maybe even starts before that with von Neumann a little bit, talking about sort of the atomic age, this sort of like polymath genius, von Neumann, who was the first to write about the idea of the singularity, and then obviously immediately influenced Wiener, and like to the extent, and also Marvin Minsky, who we can talk about in a second if you'd like.
Yeah. Let me approach cybernetics from a slightly different direction and jump to where we are today in terms of generative AI. It's largely been forgotten, but after Jobs left Apple in the 1980s, John Sculley was looking for a vision, and Sculley was not technical, and so he turned to his technology laboratory, which was run at that point by Alan Kay, and said, "I need a new vision for Apple." He had to speak at an education conference, and so Kay's group created this vision video called Knowledge Navigator, which has largely been forgotten. And it was a very short 3 or 4 minute video that showed the interaction between an absent-minded professor and an avatar in a desktop, portable computer. Complete the model. I mean, the best example of it right now is Google Gemini, which has this live conversational mode. They had a visual avatar, and so it was part of that problem of conflating, anthropomorphizing machines. But I took a look at that when I was working on Machines of Love and Grace, and I thought, well, what are the roots? And I went to the two designers of Siri, Tom Gruber and Adam Chire, and I said, well, what's this about? And they said, well, we were simply trying to build Knowledge Navigator when we started Siri. This is before Apple bought Siri. That was their intent, was to build a Knowledge Navigator system. And I said, I then went to Alan Kay and said, where did your group get these ideas? And they said, Nicholas Negroponte. And I said, well, that's interesting, because I knew Nicholas, and Media Lab had done all of these video demos. If you go back through their archives, it was all there in the early 1980s. Nicholas had gotten to it. So I went to Nicholas and I said, well, where did you get these ideas? And he said, Gordon Pask. And I said, who? And Gordon Pask was a British cyberneticist and psychologist who was hanging out around the Media Lab in the 1980s. He was very close to Marvin Minsky. Come back to Minsky. And he believed that human intelligence, emerged from the conversational interaction of human actors, which I think is a really interesting model. And so it does go back to cybernetics. And here we are today in the midst of the deployment of this at scale.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. You go back to what you think are these like stuffy, like guys in suits hanging out in like ivory towers, and has nothing to do with your life. But then you can trace it forward to like, this is exactly the things that they're talking about in Silicon Valley even today, and still trying to hash out. Just to talk a little bit about, this idea, I think overarching, I think the idea here is to sort of work towards conflating humans and machines to some extent in terms of like systems theory. This is kind of the new insight, I think, of cybernetics, is like that everything is a system. It has inputs and outputs. There are energy flows, like electricity flows almost, and that human intelligence, the way the mind works, the way everything works, the way the globe works, the environment works, is all a system of inputs and outputs that can be quantified and then controlled.
Yeah.
That is the idea.
Yeah. And, one of the things I spent a lot of time trying to figure out when I wrote my most recent book, which was a biography of Stuart Brand. So in 2017, when I started research on the Brand biography, the zeitgeist on Silicon Valley had flipped very rapidly. Silicon Valley as a place in the sort of on the political landscape had been a place that could do no wrong, and went from being a place that could go very rapidly to a place that could do no right. And two books came out that sort of focused on that in the spring and winter and spring of 2017. There was Move Fast and Break Things by Jonathan Taplin, and A World Without Mind by Franklin Foer. And I kind of was stunned because they both began with biographical sketches of Stuart Brand. These are books that are attempting to explain Silicon Valley. And I did not get that, how this hippie who had been a publisher could be conflated with the emergence of Silicon Valley. And so I spent a lot of time trying to understand that. And I think I did in a different way than many people did. And Stuart Brand showed up in Silicon Valley in proto-Silicon Valley in 1966. And in 1968, he published a catalog. Steve Jobs has referred to it as Google before Google, called the Whole Earth Catalog. And it was deeply woven into cybernetics ideas. So the early catalog was really defined by its interest in cybernetic ideas. But, the question was, how is it that Stuart Brand came to the Valley in 66? What did he see? Because Brand tended at that point to see things early on. And both of those books were sort of making the argument that Brand was the person who was the key figure in creating this culture of digital utopianism. And first of all, Brand would cringe at the notion that he was a utopian. He thought of himself as a pragmatist, but that's neither here nor there. But I also think that both of those books got things 180 degrees wrong in this early sense. I don't think Brand instigated anything. He was the first messenger. He was the first one to understand that something was happening on the ground. But Taplin, on the other hand, I think he, in terms of the evolution of Silicon Valley ideology, defines the digital utopians that came out of that period, and then a second generation of digital libertarians that were associated with the PayPal mafia. And I think that fairly reflects an evolution in ideas in Silicon Valley that it is accurate.
I think that's definitely where we're headed at some point. I think digital utopianism is a great thing to appeal to raise a Series A.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we can set aside a history a little bit. I just want to go through just briefly. So Marvin Minsky was an advisor on 2001: A Space Odyssey. He was basically the inventor of HAL, and sort of this idea of like society of mind. His book is about the idea of agents. So like agents existing in your mind that can do various things, in the interaction of them as if in a machine makes intelligence. And now we have AI agents, which I think is probably directly descended from that. So you can see these terms kind of like coming up, and even the whole project altogether, sort of the culmination of cybernetics is something called an ecosystem. Silicon Valley is an ecosystem. That's what it's called. And sort of the history of ecosystems kind of leads to this idea that if we can just get more data about what we're trying to control, then the model and the ecosystem inputs, outputs, the things we control gets better and better. So if you think about the early ideas of Facebook when they were turning on their feed and trying to adjust it with algorithms, they were doing these psychology research studies, A/B testing, and figuring out how they could like turn the knobs on their ecosystem, which was society at that point. And, I think sort of a criticism of that is that everything that you try to do on that front is oversimplifying and will create second order effects because you don't actually have a whole picture of what the ecosystem that you're trying to control is, or an ecosystem can never be bounded.
Yeah. There are these generations in Silicon Valley that I've watched, and certainly social media, which appeared, sort of 2008, 2006, 2007, 2008, was a wave in Silicon Valley that sort of moved the coverage in Silicon Valley, I think, in a profoundly sort of non-technical direction, in the sense that the issues became about society and not about the technology at a certain point, because it was affecting people's lives in a very different way than it had before. The internet also changed the equation. And it's still one of the profound questions about whether you need place to be innovative. The Valley was an innovation center. Is it necessary for the next wave of innovation? I thought it was remarkable. I was spending a lot of time in Europe in 2005, 2006, and I was seeing innovations happen there in mobile computing before they happened in the Valley. And it seemed with Nokia and the various operating systems, things that were happening in Europe, that the next platform might be European. And then the iPhone happened, and the center of gravity and innovations shifted back to the Valley. It happened just again in the most dramatic way possible. And I love it because nobody expected generative AI to have the force that it had, not even the people who invented it. And in terms of, the visionaries, it came completely out of left field. And it happened at Google, right in the center of Silicon Valley. And once again, the Valley became the center of this wave just when all of the digital libertarians were saying it was over, and they were decamping for Malibu or Austin or Miami. And, the Valley has maintained a relevant technology center, which is striking to me. I mean, I think about it in the context of this competition, this national competition with China. I was in China at the end of 2016 in the third ring in Beijing, and was really quite stunned to see that, Peter Thiel was going on about how the Chinese were stealing technology from America. And when I got to Beijing, it's certainly true they were stealing technology from America. I can tell you stories about Stanford University, but more to the point, they had borrowed our culture. They had completely borrowed Silicon Valley's culture. When you got to that region in Beijing, I felt like I was right at home. I mean, even English language was. I mean, you could operate in Beijing as easily as you could operate. They were devoted to the ideals of Silicon Valley. And then, of course, Xi shut it all down in the most remarkable way. And so I have this debate with a friend about whether a command and control economy can be an innovative economy. DeepSeek has raised this question again.
Yeah. I think we're starting to see, even in our discussion, sort of this conflation of innovation and power. So like, Clausewitz would say, like, the military historian talking about war would say, like, the most important thing to identify in your enemy is the hub of all power and movement, right? So like, we're talking about power centers that move, and that is very closely associated with more, I think, with government and politics and armies and things than it is with technology. But so I think we're kind of starting to tread into this territory of the conflation of power, government, and tech to some extent, which I think was there all the time. Yeah, probably.
Well, so that should take us, back to cybernetics and autonomous systems, because this is a cultural thing that I worry about a lot. Let's talk about it through some of Elon Musk's assertions and his activities. He created a company called Neuralink, and his stated purpose for creating Neuralink was to make it sure that humans controlled rather than were being controlled by the systems that they were creating. And it's pretty clear to me that he's never watched Star Trek, because he doesn't know about the Borg and that resistance is futile and you will be assimilated. I think the most dangerous thing I can think of is to tightly couple humans to systems in ways that they can't uncouple. I think it's essential that we keep a bright line between the systems we create and what is human. Yeah. But we seem to be crossing that line in really interesting ways everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's one of the indirect things that I would worry about most even with, you were just talking about social media and the power of algorithms. And, I began seeing generational changes where I would bump into people who, had met their match through an algorithm, and more of our world is mediated by this computational fabric that we've created, and in obvious and non-obvious ways.
You have to think about who was the first mover on these things and who is leading whom. And I think that one thing we could look at is like who has an interest in creating this power, and oftentimes the answer is the government. So I think that one thing we could maybe do is make a quick speed run through the history of Silicon Valley and the government. I think I'm just curious about, if it's possible, where would you start that story if you were to look all the way back?
One place to start would be with Frederick Terman. So Terman had been deeply involved in this World War II war effort, and he had some very distinct ideas about the relationship between corporations and the government, and and academia. He had this notion of temples of excellence, and he came back from being at MIT to Stanford with the notions of creating that kind of scholarly community, but one that was not isolated from the business world, but which was directly connected to a corporate world that serviced a government that had needs for technology.
Sounds familiar.
And he built the infrastructure for Silicon Valley, the creation of the Stanford Industrial Park, which was adjacent to the Stanford University campus in the 1940s, was in intention to foster a tight coupling with a corporate world that was tied very closely to a government that had technological needs. So that's one place to start.
I think another point to stop on this is probably the space race,
Absolutely.
And then sort of a proximity story a little bit. I think, last night, kind of in preparation for this interview, I wanted to have a little think, and so I drove myself down to the salt marshes in the southern end of Silicon Valley and walked out. And, if you look south, it's very easy to see the Googleplex, and then right behind it, see this this sort of like spinning light and lots of red little lights in the darkness, which is the Google is in the light and this is in the darkness. So I wonder if you could tell me what I saw.
So you saw Moffett Field, which is great because there are lots of threads to pull on here. The one I like to pull on is okay, so there's this thing called Moore's Law, and Gordon Moore is associated with this idea of sort of defining the semiconductor manufacturing process and what came out. And the Valley lived off of Moore's Law for a half a century before it ended.
How fast semiconductors chips will improve?
The generational rate of change of semiconductors. So Doug Engelbart, as a freshly minted electrical engineer, first went to work in the 1940s in those wind tunnels at Moffett Field. They were being used to design aircraft, and the aerospace engineers had this notion of this idea called similitude. And basically, what they would do is they would design small aircraft models in the wind tunnel and then scale them up. So that was this notion of scaling. He had a fundamental understanding of that. And when he saw the photolithographic process that Noyce had created in the late 1950s, he immediately understood that it would be exponential. And in 1960, he went to an electronics conference in Philadelphia and gave a talk about scaling and the art of similitude, where he outlined very clearly that there was going to be this exponential rise in computing power. And you had to think about the consequences of exponential change. But once again, this is my current obsession is that, there are 5 to 7 good explanations of why Silicon Valley happened. I think they're all accurate, and I think they're all necessary, but they're also incomplete. And so, there's the military explanation, there's the semiconductor narrative, there is this sort of larger governmental question that Margaret O'Mara gets at, the role of the government in forming Silicon Valley. There is Shockley, there's the Fairchildren, there's the electronic warfare industry in particular that sort of came later, but that was really in the mid-70s. That was the driving force of electronics before before the commercialization, the non-military commercialization happened.
One just brief thought is like, I think there's always kind of been this symbiotic relationship between tech, between governments and think tanks. We run a think tank here at the Berggruen Institute. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the role of think tanks.
Well,
in all this.
So they're different think tanks. I mean, the one of note in this case, I mean, there are three of note. I mean, the three that I think we might focus on are first, McCarthy came out here because McCarthy was fleeing MIT for a variety of reasons, and he created the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. It started as the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Project, and it was turned into a laboratory, and it was located in the hills behind Stanford campus. It did the very first work on autonomous vehicles, happened there. On the other side of campus, there was SRI, which was the Stanford Research Institute, and actually was part of Stanford, and had been created, I believe, in the 1940s. And then Xerox, wanting to compete in the new information technology industries with IBM, set up a lab adjacent to Stanford in a third direction, also about a half a mile from campus, called the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in 1970. Three slightly different models, all think tanks. SRI was affected dramatically by the anti-war movement. It became a flashpoint because the students discovered that they were doing classified research to help the war in Vietnam.
Sounds familiar as well. That sounds familiar as well if you think about Google recently or whatever.
Yeah, well, Google's gone back and forth, right? Yeah. They just shifted back to serving the government. But historically, the valley, the heart of the valley, has taken. This is before it became super ideological. For pragmatic reasons, the valley stayed away from close ties with the military-industrial complex because of the nature of military contracting, and that was sort of companies like Intel resisted the notion, and they no longer had the need to be, because of the emergence of a commercial microelectronics market, to be government contractors. And so there was this hands-off relationship for many years. So, when I started, new technologies would be developed by large corporations or the military, and they would trickle down into consumer products. In 1988, when I was newly at the New York Times, I went up to report on a brand new supercomputer maker called Kendall Square Research. They were building what became called a massively parallel supercomputer, which we now call cloud computing, but that was then. And they showed me their new microprocessor, and I was struck because their microprocessor design was being fabbed on the same semiconductor fabrication line in Japan that made the Sharp Wizard, which was this handheld device, a very early palm-sized computer. And I realized that there was this inversion going on, and that technologies that used to trickle down because of the economies of scale in computing and the exponential power of computing change, Moore's law, were now coming from the bottom up. And the way I described it was that the companies in the future who would make the fastest computers were the companies that made things that went under Christmas trees. And that it really had gotten away from the Pentagon in terms of the control of the technology. And the Valley rode off that for a long time. And now here we are at this different era, which you're focusing on.
Yeah. And I think, and you can test my hypothesis here, starting in the 21st century, we get these DARPA challenges. And I think what I've noticed kind of from the DARPA challenges is that and these DARPA challenges are like kind of when the US government wants to do something, but they don't want to spend the money to figure out how to do it, or they want to spend less money to figure out how to do it. They sort of like put these challenges out there and then ask private industry to respond and figure out ways that, the things that engineers do well, like how to solve problems. And so they've gotten these DARPA challenges for all sorts of things: robotics, self-driving cars.
Yeah, there are a number of things.
Shredding paper actually was one of them, like how to shred government documents fast so you could like get rid of classified stuff. Rockets, I think, was an interesting one. And now obviously there's one in AI. But I think over the course of these DARPA challenges that roughly extend from like the early 2000s to even today, you see this shift to where like the things government is asking for, they want to have in the future, and that leads to some company down the line doing them. But the shift has kind of been a little bit towards they're asking for something and the companies already do them better than the thing that they're asking for. And I think the classic example of this is rockets and space, so starting in like, I think 2016 or so, 2017, there was the DARPA rocket challenge, which the idea of was to be able to make small launch vehicles that could send satellites into space, and create these things called satellite constellations, with small satellites. And so this started, or sort of like spurred, a few companies. Rocket Lab was one of them in New Zealand that actually developed a rocket that could go to space. There was a bunch of other losers in this competition, obviously, but none of them got even close to something that already existed, which was SpaceX, and now something that is changing the world, Starlink. So I think that what I take away from this is this kind of like very clear example of a shift in power and a shift in innovation. Do you see the same thing?
It's interesting. I covered the early ones. I have not followed the more recent ones. So I was the Automotive Grand Challenge that Tony Tether created, and Tony Tether was an electrical engineering graduate student at Stanford during the anti-war protests. I think he was tremendously sort of influenced by that. But it was Tether who sort of was the first to start these DARPA challenges. And the Waymos probably are a direct result of that. But more to the point, I mean, I think the more interesting question to me is around autonomous weapons. And, the United States had an interesting debate about autonomy and control, human control, which I think is now effectively over. And I think it is one of the greatest threats to humanity in the world now, being played out every day on the battlefield in the Ukraine. The pace of drone innovation is now not happening in the laboratory; it's happening on the battlefield. And I've heard that it takes about 3 weeks for the Russians to reverse engineer the hardware side of a new Ukrainian drone, and both sides are using them. And what's striking to me about this debate about human control is that I've seen articles about the value of autonomous weapon systems being that they will not be targeted at humans, but in fact, look at Ukraine. The humans are the target. Civilians are they will not be targeted at civilians. Civilians are the targets, and I think we've crossed over a boundary, and that's
bright line that you're talking about.
Yeah, where this is the new face of warfare. Stuart Russell, one of the authors of the definitive textbook on AI, he is an AGI believer, but he also has great concerns about the military uses of these technology. Commissioned the creation of a video called Slaughterbots, which I would urge everyone to look at. It's on YouTube, which sort of points the direction this technology is going. The scenario that sketches out is since these things all fall to the level of things you can buy on Amazon, control is impossible. And as these technologies are developed, they will be used in ways that we can't foresee now.
Mm-hmm.
That's a matter. It's inevitable at this point.
It's definitely something we have to think about. I mean, I think, to the point I was talking about earlier about sort of maybe private industry outpacing government in its ability to respond and innovate. I think there's one way you look at it is like, the CIA could become is kind of Palantir to some extent. The NASA is SpaceX, like to some extent these days.
Or do you flip it? Does Palantir become the CIA?
I think, Palantir is becoming the CIA.
Yeah.
SpaceX, I mean, this is a gross oversimplification, but Palantir is becoming the CIA, and Dural, this autonomous weapons company, is sort of like worming its way into like this AI acquisitions process for the military, or SpaceX is becoming NASA to some extent, because the government can't do any of these things without these private companies, whereas before it was pushing these private companies to do these things.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I hadn't really thought that through, but you can see that transformation happening in real time around us right now. Yeah, and we're obviously in a new world. Those trends that you're describing will be accelerated over the next 4 years.
Absolutely. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, is like a good way to put it is, we just did an interview with Neil Ferguson, the sort of conservative thinker, and he sort of like talks about this arms AI arms race with China, and says that maybe we will lose because we don't have the ability to spur innovation. China has all this wealth and sort of like the cheaper things that they can do with their labor force, and they have maybe to some extent a more innovative economy than us. And the United States has all this deficit spending in the typical conservative way that hampers our development and means that we are kind of destined to be behind. But I think that discounts the fact that while the United States has deficits, SpaceX doesn't, all these AI companies don't.
Well, he's very pessimistic. Was that his?
Well, he's not. I mean, yeah, he's pessimistic
in terms of the competition with China.
He's pessimistic about the U.S. ability through its government to create the level of innovation necessary to match the Chinese.
Yeah. Well, I think that question of U.S.-China competition is still much more open. What was DeepSeek? It was still largely built on U.S. innovation, whatever it was. I mean, Llama was a huge factor in what DeepSeek did, and Llama was an intentional effort by Facebook to open source AI technology, which the Chinese took advantage of, but they were riding on our technology. We're creating these walls. I'm seeing the bifurcation of this global bi-oceanic economy that had emerged between Silicon Valley and China that is being sundered right now. And I don't know what it's going to look like after it's separated. But the Chinese, they have their own problems. I mean, to see the Chinese as this monolithic empire that they have a real estate bubble that's popping that maybe is as devastating as ours was in 2008 or 2009. So I don't think the game is over in any sense. And it's not clear to me what's going on in terms of innovation in China. I think it's a more nuanced situation than he's painting. Xi is very much into command and control. The Financial Times in October or November had a piece that pointed out the period that I was there were a peak of, I think, 50,000 Chinese startups, and the number is now closer to 2,500. So where does the innovation happen if it's not happening in a corporate startup environment? Startups are not being encouraged the way they were in China when I was there. So not clear. At one point I had a meal with Kai-Fu Lee, who's a Taiwanese, U.S., Chinese investor. And in his venture firm, he was just very clear saying he wouldn't get anywhere near semiconductor investing in China because there was so much corruption. Mm-hmm. He didn't trust it. So they've got their own corruption problems in different ways than we do. So
I guess what he's saying to some extent is, if the AI arms race is won by China, and first off, I'm a little bit skeptical about calling it an arms race or a war or any of these kinds of framings. Obviously, this is very advantageous to these AI companies to call it such.
Yeah.
But if it is won by China, it will be won by the government. And if it is won by the United States, it will be won by these companies.
Yeah.
I think that's what he's saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the field has shifted. People like Eric Schmidt are investing in ways that worry me a great deal, investing in autonomous weapons companies because of this issue of controlling these technologies and unexpected uses for technologies that are open sourced and accessible broadly. I think so we have this AI international AI conference in Europe this week.
The Paris Action.
AI Action.
The president of our institute is there right now as we speak.
Well, it's but if you look at it historically, the framing sort of context that I'd like you to look at it is in terms of the Asilomar conference that happened in the early 1970s, where biologists confronted with the profound new technologies got together and actually stopped doing research because they were concerned about the impact that it might have on humanity. Mm. Well, so the AI scientists tried to mimic that in 2009. They got together at Asilomar and they debated this question about the impact of this technology and also the notion of a pause. And at various times, people have talked about pause. Now nobody's talking about pause.
It's impossible to talk about.
Let's accelerate. Yeah.
So everybody's an EAC right now.
It is impossible, but, it's not clear that the biologists weren't right to me.
So to get to the sort of get to the heart of the matter, I think we've established like a pretty thorough and robust base for the question that we're going to talk about right now, which is like kind of how I think about it. We are entering this world, which is uncharted territory, of leaders of Silicon Valley, sort of like maybe this flip is reversed, like the tail could be wagging the dog. And I want to test your assumptions on this.
I think so there's all of this discussion about what's Elon about, what's he up to. I think honestly, I'm still in shock about what he's been able to do since he turned. I mean, it puts the acquisition in Twitter in a new context. When we talk about what mainstream media is, he bought the media. He bought it and he used it as a megaphone. He completely transformed it. I don't believe the Mars narrative. I think that's a smokescreen. That's Elon using science fiction tropes. I think you're right. It's about power. I don't have a great deal of evidence, but you just look at what's going on. The notion that he could bring his 4-year-old to the Oval Office gives you a sense of where we are. I also, not firsthand knowledge. I think it's we have to talk about Elon and drug use. I think it's really quite extraordinary that because I've never been to Burning Man, but I have good friends who are burners who have been to Burning Man, who have spent years in Elon's camp. So I have secondhand knowledge of his personal use of drugs. It's not just ketamine. And I've seen him in person at times being completely inarticulate. I mean, being like word salad inarticulate. People tend to say that his activities suggest brilliance. I see more evidence of bullying and the ability to seize power. The Tesla narrative, I think, is the classic example of that. He wasn't the Tesla founder. Martin Eberhard was the founder of Tesla, and he pushed the founders out and he changed the narrative. And I think that's gone on over and over again. I think it's about power. So where does that go? I mean, we see a power struggle between Donald Trump and his MAGA backers and Elon Musk. And I also, I cringe at the notion of saying the people who say that Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, David Sachs, Ben Horowitz et al. Represent Silicon Valley.
The PayPal Mafia.
The PayPal Mafia, that's right. Well, the PayPal Mafia has even got its own divisions.
Yeah. Well, that's actually kind of where I wanted to go. Before we get there, I did have a question on my list here. Because I was curious, what do you think the ideological influence of Burning Man has been on Silicon Valley?
Oh, I think it is a reflection of a sort of a counterculture thread that has run through Silicon Valley for a long time. Burning Man is an expression of that in a lot of ways. The intersection of psychedelics and our artistic culture and a technology culture that is, and once again, when you talk about boots on the ground, there is a mainstream group of Silicon Valley software and hardware engineers who have that kind of cultural perception, and we're part of the fabric of creating Burning Man. They are makers, and I think that's you draw that out, and the Burning Man culture is very much a part of that. So that took me to this notion of the sort of the missing ingredient to try to explain the Silicon Valley culture, which is what I'm trying to get at now, and why this notion of creativity on the edge of chaos, which I came out of the Santa Fe Institute and these physicists who study complexity theory, and turned toward social science at one point. Stuart Kauffman in particular had this idea that...
who was Stuart Kauffman?
Oh, I'm sorry. Stuart Kauffman was a biologist and a physicist who was one of the key people for many years at the Santa Fe Institute. And he proposed, a group of people proposed this idea that you get innovation in a social sense out of these being perched on the edge of chaotic environments. And I had written Dormouse before I read this, and I looked at it again, and I said, well, that perfectly describes the Mid-Peninsula at that point in time. There were these 3 laboratories that were isolated but adjacent to this incredibly turbulent community, which was the Mid-Peninsula around Stanford. There was the anti-war movement. There was psychedelic music. There were psychedelic drugs. There was this general desire by my generation to augment the human mind in various ways, from cults to psychedelics. And there's a civil rights movement, all sort of roiling around these laboratories. And I think it's a perfect case study of that and the key ideas. And I think ideas is important here in fighting back against technological determination. There were particular framing references for how technology might happen that emerged then, that drove the Valley for the next half century.
Yeah. And I think that's all great points. And to sort of just go back to Burning Man a little bit, I think the one thing that's always confused me a little bit about this is all these tech CEOs, the midline engineers, the managers, everybody. Basically, there's like a sort of like migration from Silicon Valley over the Reno Pass and into the Black Rock every year. And when they get there, they adhere to certain principles of Burning Man. So leave no trace, radical self-reliance, a gift economy that is not based on capitalism, safety third, which actually is maybe the only one that they actually pay attention to in the real world. But when they come back to the default world, as they call it, none of these principles translate. And I'm kind of curious about that.
Some of them do. I mean, open sources.
I mean, in the eyes of CEOs who definitely aren't in a gift economy or...
are the CEOs real burners? I mean,
that's a fair question. They might be sort of...
there's, what do you call it?
They might be plug and play camping.
Tourists. They're Burning Man tourists.
They call it plug and play camping. So they show up. They don't build their own thing.
Yeah, and they fly in too. And they fly
sometimes
out.
in a helicopter,
Yeah. I mean, so wealth can do all kinds of things, including distort your view of the world.
So you're saying the CEOs might not be the biggest people to look at for the Burning Man principles.
I don't think that those guys are actual makers. And I find
CEOs
that...
CEOs are not makers.
Yeah. I don't think so as a rule. I think they're managers, largely. And occasionally they're visionaries. But
they definitely fancy themselves makers.
Yeah, I know they do. But do any of them make? They manage people. That's what they do. Once you get past the scale of probably 20 people, you're a manager.
Yeah,
you're not doing you're dealing with accounts and you're dealing with the outside world.
So we're kind of closing in on what I want to finish with here, and I think we've done a really good job of building up towards it. So there's this IA versus AI debate, and then there's if you're thinking about the genealogy or the memetics of things in the Silicon Valley, how these things advance forward as it relates to AI, as it relates to what we've been seeing, in the last, say, 15 years, we're seeing these schisms even within this community. You sort of alluded to them already, the PayPal mafia side of things. There's also which is often associated with the libertarian strain of Silicon Valley. But even within the libertarian or logic-based aspect of Silicon Valley, you have say the less wrong folks who have become sort of the main doomers, as opposed to the Andreessenists who are the main accelerationists, EACs.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can sort of translate this this framing that you have from the 60s that obviously then goes forward to the 90s and even to the early 2000s into what you're seeing today. That's a big question.
A hugely difficult question because, first of all, let me take refuge in pointing out that what I said, I think before the cameras were rolling, that, I'm in my Rip Van Winkle phase. I've been in the library for the last 10 years and I just walked out and my eyes are blinking. And all of these communities, I would say religious communities have come to the fore, particularly over this question of AGI. Maybe we should talk about it in the context of where we are with respect to AGI. So AGI is this...
artificial general intelligence.
Artificial general intelligence is this made-up term. Before we talked about AGI, we used to talk about weak and strong AI. Strong AI was, everything a human can be. here's a question. When you talk about AGI, does it include a human quality that we call a moral compass? And now that takes us right back to three laws. I personally am in the school that believes that we're still a long way away from AGI. Let's go back to the critique of Minsky in the 1960s made by, was it Huberman, who responded to Minsky et al. In the 1960s as saying that we're close to artificial intelligent machines is like saying a monkey who has climbed to the top of the tree is closer to the moon. I think that we still don't know what intelligence is. And unless we can define what intelligence is with certainty, how can we come up with the term artificially general intelligence? And so I think we're in Turing test territory, where it is true that, what was the Turing test? It was, how good are we at fooling humans? And I think we're getting really good at fooling humans. We've crossed the uncanny valley, and we can create machines that are so lifelike that we can't tell that they're machines. But anytime you interact with a chatbot today in an area that you know a lot about and have domain proficiency, you'll realize that its accuracy is in the 60 or 70% level. That there's hallucination is a problem that's not been solved, and that in fact we're seeing I think that these are not stochastic parrots in terms of their usefulness. There's a little more than a stochastic.
Stochastic parrot means they just semantics.
Yeah, the pattern matching gives you the illusion of intelligence. They're remarkably useful, and yet, you see these flashes of the illusion of reasoning, although I don't think it's actually reasoning in a human sense. But I wouldn't trust them. And so we've gone from this world. What was it that Ronald Reagan said? Trust but verify. I would say we're at a point where, with these machines, where I would say verify but don't trust. So there are all these communities that I think are shaped around religious beliefs. You talked about the effective altruists, the accelerationists, and
the doomers, the foomers.
Am I missing?
The foomers are people like foomers are like advanced EACs who think that like foom is the like the big exponential leap to AGI that's going to come.
Yeah.
Like, foom.
Oh, I got it. Okay. I didn't know about the foomers. So Professor of Religion wrote a book in about 2009 or 2000 where he sort of took these, I'm blanking on the title of the book. But he basically drew the parallels between religious beliefs and some of the AI community at that time, the Minskys and the Kurzweils, who had these sort of religious views of the coming of these godlike creatures. And I don't think anything's changed. I think it's become more refined, which is what you're describing. The religious communities have been really quite remarkable. I went about a year ago to one of these foo camps in the hills in Silicon Valley.
What is a foo camp? I've never heard of
it's
this.
a camp where it's an encampment or a conference, and where you make up the discussion items as you go along, and everything focused on a generative AI, except. There were three other categories. So it was all generative AI, except the people, the effective altruists, who at that point, this was a year ago, wanted to figure out what they got wrong. And then the most interesting one, there were roboticists who were trying to figure out why the robotics startups haven't gone anywhere, still true a year later. And then there were the people who just wanted to hook up. And so that, to me, sort of expresses Silicon Valley today. I don't pretend to have a deep understanding of where the valley is, but I do think it is true that the iconic people that Trump has chosen to associate with, to say that they are example of Silicon Valley taking over the government, or whatever you want to say about what's going on right now, or the government using Silicon Valley. I think that it, does an injustice to what Silicon Valley is. I mean, they are something. Those moguls, I think, are something more about power than any of the original or even the current communities in Silicon Valley. Something happened that is, a corruption of all of the Valley's values. I mean, digital libertarianism was a resurrection of ideas surrounding Ayn Rand, and the digital libertarianism of today seems to be libertarianism for me, but not for you, which is not libertarianism in any sense I understand. I mean, Musk's power grabs are not about traditional libertarian ideas. It's about something else that are power centric, and it tremendously worries me. But I don't understand it, and I don't think it's right to interpret it in the context of Silicon Valley.
I sort of only have two more questions. One is sort of like a return to machines of loving grace. So the CEO of Anthropic in October of this past year released an essay called Machines of Loving Grace, which sort of like claims, it's a very long essay. So
I have to confess I haven't read yet.
Well, it's long. It's a very rosy picture of the capabilities of AI. So basically, like, AGI comes next year in 2026, and within 10 years, we double our lifespan, among other things, including like a peace dividend, nobody fights wars anymore, all coming very soon to your computer. What is this aspect of Machines of Loving Grace?
I think that's, when I read that poem, there was a lot of irony in it. It's quite possible that he could have been a skeptic. And as a matter of fact, the fact that he put certain references in parentheses to me was and maybe the CEO of Anthropic missed the irony. So what evidence is there that AGI will come next year? I mean, so I've made an entire career out of saying the visionaries are always wrong. And that's usually been quite true about Silicon Valley, is that the technologies that come next and where things go have come out of left field and surprised people continually over a long period of time. And I think that has something to do with, exponential pace of technological change, that it's hard to predict. And in fact, it's not deterministic. But also the fact that these things are not able to give accurate answers today to really simple questions, to suggest we're close to AGI, suggests to me that we're dealing with ideological or religious beliefs and not engineering reality. And so tremendously valuable machines. They're going to have an impact in labor markets that I think is super interesting, and I think also unclear to me yet. I mean, I'm still not having useful conversations with machines at customer service, and that's what they promised me. Well, so I assume that will start to happen, and that will have a big impact on the economy. They assert that all kinds of other parts of the modern corporation are going to be transformed by this, and we'll see.
Yeah.
All that can happen without being anywhere near AGI or getting to those deeper moral and philosophical questions. I still think we have to ask about what happens when we're dealing with machines that don't have moral compasses. And that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah. It's very hard to predict these things, obviously. I mean, I doing the research for this podcast, I looked back at a lot of podcasts that you've done before. You go back to like 2017. This is not a gotcha. But
what did I say? God help us.
The quote was, if a car can come and pick me up in Castro and take me down to South Valley by 2025, right, I will buy you dinner.
So I'm still not wrong.
Okay.
Because Waymo is not servicing. I mean, you can get a ride in San Francisco, but you can't get a ride down to Palo Alto yet.
Oh, they won't take you all the way?
No, they won't even take you to the airport unless they're offering airport service now.
All right. So yeah, okay. Well, maybe once they get to the airport, you can buy me dinner.
If by December they can do that, I have to buy somebody dinner. It can be you.
All right. I will take the dinner if it's possible. I wanted to talk about something slightly different. Maybe I think that's something that you've talked about over the course of your career, is that oftentimes the visionaries are sci-fi writers.
Yes.
And that, I think this is an interesting thing of like, well, is who's wagging whom? Why do we keep making our own dystopias into reality? Like that seems like a very weird thing to do.
I've struggled with that throughout my career. I mean, one of the first things that I met in the 1980s, I was completely taken with Stevenson's and Gibson's cyberpunkian view of the world. And I was a young reporter at InfoWorld, and I was reading science fiction, and then I was seeing things that I was reporting that were mimicking their view of the world. I mean, that was the first time I saw the sort of that parallel. And then, Knowledge Navigator is one of the sort of classic examples of the vision driving the engineering. I mean, that's my argument too about the Valley. And what's missing is there were these three big ideas that came early, and the Valley's been feeding off those visions, which were not really science fiction visions, but they were visions in the 1960s that drove innovation.
These philosophical ideas that we've been talking about. I think, in so much as we can predict the world going forward, you have your vast knowledge of Silicon Valley ideology. And we are looking at this like merging to some extent of tech and government, of a certain segment of tech and a certain ideology of tech and government. I think it's helpful to look at Snow Crash because it is the one that takes place in the world where the government has sort of collapsed, and this idea of anarcho-capitalism, sort of unrestrained capitalism, has come into being. So we live in a world where governments across the world have collapsed, and instead what has popped up in their place is corporations that control bounded territories and provide services to citizens based on money. And they're all kind of walled off, and you have to be a citizen of different corporations. And on top of that, there's a layer, which is important in this context, called the metaverse, which is a place which is actually just a long street. And there are companies alongside the street in the metaverse, and you go occasion those, but it's nicer than reality. And you can buy territory in the metaverse, and people have like higher real estate values the closer they get to the street. So that's the basics.
It's a very good, what I remember, two things that are a little bit different. One is the assertion in that book that America is a country that only does two things well. One is write software, and the other is deliver pizzas. And, we're going in that direction. And the other is, which I had, I got to know Stevenson, and the protagonist of that book.
His name is literally Hiro Protagonist.
Hiro protagonist, a Japanese cyber ninja.
Well, just to get to the core of it here a little bit, I think like the question is what will happen like as Silicon Valley works its way into government, based on what you know of Silicon Valley ideology and what we see in these sort of visions that I think actually probably this one is maybe the closest to sort of like the digital libertarian ideology.
I want to suggest another one, but yes. Okay. So what will happen? But I let me take refuge. Although I'm blanking on his name. There's a British or perhaps Irish or Scottish author who wrote a book called Accelerando. But I think of all the science fiction literature, if you want to capture where we are today, which is the impact of these technologies. So you take cryptography and microprocessors and biological technology and put them all together, and you get Accelerando. So he put it on the web as a book that anybody can read for free. It's 400 pages long. You don't need to read the whole thing. You need to read the first 40 pages, and your hair will stand on end. So I think that vision of the collapse of the nation state, I would have thought 5 years ago I would have laughed. Now I'm not laughing because I think that's a real possible end game to where we are. They are in the process of destroying the nation state as we speak, and I don't know where we go. The guardrails are almost all gone. The last guardrail after the courts, I suppose, is the market. And, they may move fast enough that they may destroy the economy of the United States in addition to the government. But we're into territory that I don't understand. And yes, I think it's the technology, but I don't think it's Silicon Valley. So if I can make that separation, there's a bellicose relationship of certain forces, and certainly there are elements of Silicon Valley who are driving that. But I don't think that expresses, I don't think if you say Silicon Valley, you capture the the reality of what's going on in the actions of people like Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen and et al., who seem to be the driving force here, at least who've allied themselves with Trump. And where they're going, I don't feel qualified to answer that question.
All right. Well, none of us do, but we will watch together. John Markoff, thank you so much for joining us. I learned a lot in the conversation, and I look forward to speaking more in the future.
Thank you for having me.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Berggruen, Nathan Gardells, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardells, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.